Get started. And Craig, you said you're hitting record?
Already done.
Great. Okay, thanks. Okay, so we're going to get started. I appreciate everyone joining us for our weekly COVID-19 briefing call for the Newark funding community. Today, we're going to spend a bulk of the time talking about the undocumented community. As we were talking about the agenda for this call, I think it became clear that there's a lot for me to learn about organizations that are working with this community. Obviously, the importance of being sure that they are served and supported during this time, and I think that this is probably the first of more conversations that we will have to have. And so, to start, we asked Vicki Hernandez at Ironbound Community Corporation to join us, as well as Sarah Cullinane from Make the Road, New Jersey, and I'm hoping that Pastor Michael Ogunleye will join us as well after that, just for a few moments to speak about. Oh, great. Okay, so we'll have you speak after the two of them on the African community and the African undocumented community. So we have a great agenda. David Scuteri is going to join us briefly a little later, just to give us a quick Newark Board of Education update. And then if we have time, Catherine and I can just talk a little bit about funds status. So with that, let's get right to Vicki. I want to thank Vicki. She had a conflict and she made it work this morning. So thank you so much for joining us on this call. And Vicki, it would be really helpful if you could share with us the work that Ironbound Community Corporation is doing right now, what you're seeing on the ground in terms of the stressors with the undocumented community, and anything else that you think it would be helpful for the group to know.
Sure. So thank you, Kevin. Thank you for inviting me to be on the call today. So Ironbound Community Corporation, as hopefully most of you know, is serving the East Ward, Newark's East Ward, that has a population of about 50,000 residents. And many of those residents are undocumented individuals, many of whom we've been working with for many, many years, primarily from South and Central America. We serve a lot of them through our Early Learning Center, which is our where we operate an early Head Start program and a Head Start program in preschool. There are over 200 families that have their children at the Early Learning Center, and we estimate that about 95% of those families are undocumented families. Soon after the pandemic, across the organization, we started doing pretty extensive outreach to all of our constituents to find out how they are being impacted and figure out how we could best support them. And so the needs started emerging pretty quickly. The most urgent need, well, I think what we noticed right away was the impact of the job losses to our community of people. Many of them work for cash wages, and so the loss of those cash wages was felt really immediately, and so that's when the request for emergency food relief really began. I would say within about a week and a half of the shelter in place order. And so food relief is something that we have been very focused on over the last 4 or 5 weeks, you know, and including our Early Learning Center families, and that includes everything from door-to-door food delivery to on-site pickup to gift card distributions. So we're serving about 900 people every week right now through our emergency food relief program. The other need that has emerged really has been households facing real challenges around making the rent, and harassment by landlords who know that they are undocumented and you know, using their status against them to threaten them. And you know, obviously they live in fear of deportation, and so that threat, even though there is an eviction ban right now, is still very real for them. And so that, you know, we are doing very extensive outreach to our constituents to let them know what their rights are, but you know, it doesn't make that fear go away, right? They're still very uninclined to report their landlords if they're being harassed. We know that because they are not able to collect unemployment because many of them do work for cash wages, you know, the financial burden for them is really severe. You know, we're working on a rent relief fund specifically for that community because they really cannot access any other publicly available resources to help, you know, make the rent. And so our concern isn't necessarily immediate in terms of their ability to pay their rent because there is the eviction ban, but once that lifts and rent comes due, they're going to have a severe, you know, backlog of rent to pay. And we're also working very closely with them to just ensure that they're communicating appropriately with their landlords to make sure that they're documenting in writing what their, you know, their inability to pay the rent, so that there's some form of documented communication between them and their landlord around their desire to want to pay the rent, but what their current situation is, because they'll need that form of backup, you know, if and when this goes to court. The other thing that that our outreach team has reported to me is that that families are still being deported. Recently, there was 6 individuals who were undocumented individuals who were rounded up at a homeless shelter. So you know you would think that that wouldn't be happening right now, but it continues to happen, and so that's something that we're very vigilant of as well. And then the other thing that we have some concerns about is their ability to you know, access medical services. And so that's something that we're also keeping an eye on as well.
Okay, great, thank you. I do have one question that came in regarding the food insecurity. Because the families are undocumented, how are they hearing about your services, or how are you working to reach undocumented families that might not already be working with you or know about your services?
You know, it's mostly word of mouth. So, you know, we do the very active outreach with our immediate families. You know, a lot of times families will be walking by if we're doing a food distribution and end up on our list that way. We'll get calls from people who were referred by others. So it really is, you know, one family telling another family, this is where you can, you know, this is a trusted organization you can go to access resources. So that's the primary vehicle. And we're also starting to work more with, there aren't many nonprofits in the Ironbound, but we're also starting to work more with those organizations to try to share resources with them as well.
I was actually going to ask that. How many other, I mean, obviously you're, as far as I know, you know, the largest organization serving folks in the East Ward, but what does the picture look like? How many other organizations?
Yeah, so the Salvation Army, we've been partnering with the Salvation Army on our food distribution program. They provide some of the, not all of the food, but some of the food that we distribute. They don't have a functioning site right now in the East Ward, which is why, and it was Stephanie from Victoria Foundation that actually made the connection for us, which I'm, you know, deeply grateful for. So we've been sort of the source for distributing the Salvation Army groceries in the Ironbound. They also operate a boys and girls club in the Ironbound, so we're going to be exploring other opportunities to partner with them. There's an organization called Montaigne, also in the East Ward, and we're, you know, they're also doing some level of food distribution, so we're trying to talk to them about how we could partner up as well. And I'm missing one. There's St. Stephen's, who we have a long-standing relationship with. So I think we're sort of exploring how we can be helpful to them as well. So, but there aren't many. You're right. It's not. There are not. You know, a huge number of organizations doing work in the Ironbound.
Victoria, this is Maria. You
Hi,
didn't,
Maria.
hi, how are you?
Good, thank you.
You did not mention, and I don't know if they're so super engaged, but the soccer associations in the East Ward are almost like another social service agency for years. Have they been approached to work with you at all?
No, I hadn't even thought of that, and nobody on my team has mentioned it, so I'm glad you did. I'll bring it up to them, and we can reach out through them. That's a really good idea.
They do a lot of, they're almost like a Lions Club. They were always raising money, doing different events, and all of that nature. I was always also going to ask you, as far as your rent relief fund, is that a place that you feel that funders could help beef up a little bit more for your needs?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, on the advocacy front, we have been very active in working on this bill that was introduced by Assemblywoman Timberlake, which would be it's a rent relief bill and a mortgage relief bill, which would essentially, buy a lot more time, would put off evictions and give tenants an opportunity to come up with a payment plan with their landlords. That could happen and it could not happen, right? It's all very tenuous. And our biggest concern, even though there are some bills out there that are gaining some traction around rent relief, is that the undocumented community still can't tap into those funds, right? And so our primary focus right now is raising a rent relief fund that would be targeted for the undocumented community because they can't access those resources anywhere else. And so, for example, we've already assessed that 50 of our 200 plus families in the Early Learning Center have already said, we've got no income coming in. We can't pay the rent. We can't pay our utility bills. And we've estimated that just for those 200 families, it would cost at least $200,000 to help them all meet the rent, right? That assumes that we're helping them bridge a gap for about 3 months. So it's a pretty, significant sum of money, and that's not even everybody. We haven't finished our assessment of how many of those families are actually unemployed right now. So that work will continue, and that's not a lot of people, right? That's a lot of money not to serve for a small number of people, right? But that's certainly going to be a huge need.
And then, Vicki, I'm seeing one other question related to domestic violence. We're hearing, that domestic violence in the city is up, and just wondering if you're seeing that there. And obviously, there are additional concerns because folks, I assume, would not want to report that. So, are you seeing an increase in those cases?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'd have to talk to our domestic violence program coordinator to get more of an update. I do know that she has said to me that the challenge right now is that if that people who are in abusive relationships don't have anywhere to go. Like literally, it's sort of too tenuous of a time to leave, right? It's awful that the better option is to stay in that home. But just given the current, state that, a lot of people are not leaving for that reason, right? So even something like our counseling services that we have available for those individuals, like they can't even participate by, some of them can't even participate by phone because they're confined in this sort of, space with their abusers, So it's, it's a pretty difficult situation right now.
Great. Okay. And just one thing, and then I know you have to go. Are there any other thoughts that you have in terms of ways that funders can be supportive of this community? I know you talked about the rent relief fund and any other things that you're seeing.
Yeah, I don't know how involved this the funders group is in doing advocacy work. I think the big challenge that we face is that a lot of the resources that are available, if it's tied to government money, it gets tricky in terms of whether or not folks can tap into those resources. And so I think if there's a way to advocate, and make that sort of a zero risk proposition for these families, and that would be really great. Because I think what's concerning is that I don't know what sum of resources would be enough to really sort of meet the needs of these families. I think ultimately, the food piece, the food relief piece, we can continue to do. I think the most concerning piece for me is the rent relief piece. And if nothing is done about it, the wave of evictions that'll inevitably happen.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Vicki. Really appreciate you taking the time. I know you have another call, so you can feel free to go and jump on that. And thanks again.
All right. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thanks
Okay.
for sharing, Vicki.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Okay, so next we are going to have Sarah Cullinane join us from Make the Road, New Jersey, to also offer some remarks on the work that she is doing there, and to add to this dialogue on serving the undocumented community. So Sarah, you can go ahead and join us and present.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity to join this meeting, and thank you, Vicki, for your remarks and all your work. My name is Sarah Cullinane. I'm the director of Make the Road, New Jersey. We're a grassroots immigrant and workers' rights organization. We're based in Elizabeth and Passaic, and we have a hub in Perth Amboy. And over the past year, we've been able to start work in Newark, thanks to a grant from the Healthcare Foundation of New Jersey, working with families on health access during the public charge crisis, which has limited some immigrants' ability to access public benefits and insurance. And so, today I wanted to talk a little bit about our work, and also just give a sort of broader overview of undocumented communities in New Jersey and in Newark, and some of the challenges and structural barriers that communities are facing during a pandemic, and during any type of sort of public emergency. And then also talk a little bit about some of the organizing and advocacy solutions and opportunities to work together. So as you all know, New Jersey is a state of immigrants. There are 500,000 undocumented people living in New Jersey. 58,000 of them live in Essex County. And undocumented immigrants are an incredibly important part of our country and of our state. They contribute $600 million in state and local taxes, $1.1 billion in federal taxes, and there are 128,000 U.S. citizen children, kids of undocumented people living here in New Jersey. So, when we see this sort of pervasive and really incredible difficulties and barriers that undocumented people are facing, it not only impacts immigrants themselves, but also their children, many of whom are U.S. citizens. And so I wanted to talk about sort of three key areas. One is around healthcare, the next is around workplace issues, and the final one on sort of access to income and income replacement. So our organization is a grassroots immigrant and workers' rights organization. We do legal services, community education, and organizing, as well as youth development. And we pivoted our work to entirely digital and phone-based outreach since the COVID pandemic started. We've launched a legal clinic, virtual legal clinic, to support undocumented people and immigrant families to access relief and to engage in any workplace issues. And through that work, we've come across some pretty horrific things happening to our communities, and have also just completed a survey and report that we'll be publishing on Thursday that's based on the experience of 250 immigrant families in New Jersey. So I hope that will also help sort of illustrate some of the issues that we're seeing. So first, on the healthcare front, undocumented immigrants are ineligible for public health insurance in New Jersey. You know, we're seeing that although there's an executive order in place that that makes testing available to all people regardless of status, and that waives copays or any type of charity care patient fee, there are still incredible barriers for immigrants to access testing. First being that, you know, a lot of the testing sites are drive-through, and if you're undocumented, you still can't get a driver's license not until January 2021 when the new law goes into effect, and so that's an incredible barrier. Another one is being able to obtain a prescription to be able to get a test, which some of the sites require. Some of the better options have been the federally qualified health centers, and some of the other testing sites where you can actually, that are more pedestrian friendly. So I think, you know, the other issue around healthcare has been that the public charge rule went into effect in February, just before the pandemic really took off. And that's meant that many immigrant families have to question whether using healthcare services, whether using Medicaid or SNAP will impact their immigration status if they're trying to adjust status. The USCIS, the Federal Immigration Agency, recently put out a ruling and notice that said that getting tested and treatment for COVID will not impact your federal immigration status or your public charge. But I think the fact that that rule just came out has also created a lot of fears. On the workplace front, there have been, we know that immigrant families, immigrant workers are really on the front line doing work in deliveries, in warehouses and logistics and factories, doing frontline work that really allows the rest of the state to stay home and to do social distancing. And unfortunately, in many of these workplaces, there are not the type of worker protections in place to really protect people. So we've seen outbreaks of COVID. We lost a member last week, a week and a half ago, to COVID at a factory where multiple workers had become infected. The employer had not implemented any type of social distancing, and workers were actually, driving to work together in a van that was sort of paid for by this temp agency that the company contracted with. And so really horrific workplace conditions that are now being investigated by OSHA, but really have not, but we really uncovered that this is the case in many workplaces across the state, particularly those where immigrants are working. And so that's a really deep concern. And what we're seeing is that immigrants are sort of having to make this incredibly difficult choice between staying home if they're sick or if they're concerned about their health or their family's health, if they have the opportunity, or going to work in really poor conditions. And if they decide to stay home, or if they lose their job, they're really completely ineligible for all wage replacement programs. That includes unemployment at the state level, the new disaster unemployment at the federal level, SNAP, although if you have U.S. citizen children, you may be eligible. And then, even the stimulus payments, the federal stimulus payments through the CARES Act, are not available to immigrant taxpayers if they file through an ITIN, which is an immigrant tax identification number. And the U.S. citizen children of immigrants and the U.S. citizen spouses of immigrants who file with an ITIN are also ineligible for stimulus payments. So what we're seeing are undocumented communities either working, continuing to work in unsafe conditions on the front lines, or, at home on their fifth week without any income, and really depending heavily on food banks for assistance, not paying rent, not being able to pay utilities, racking up fees in late payments, and really in a sort of unprecedented and horrific sort of financial insecurity that doesn't seem to have an end in sight. So it's very dire. The situation is incredibly dire. And I think there's some really important opportunities for organizing and advocacy. The first is at the federal level, immigrants were not included in most of the CARES Act, the sort of Stimulus 3 package, although our Senators Menendez and Booker heavily advocated for the inclusion of ITIN filers in the stimulus payments. Though they were included in some small business tax rebates, which has been, that will hopefully help out along the line when people file taxes. And so advocacy at the federal level, encouraging our members of Congress to push for immigrant inclusion in the stimulus, either directly through direct programs or through flexible funding that can come to New Jersey in the form of state and local assistance that our state could then use for disaster relief assistance for undocumented people. So that's sort of one option and one avenue that we're pursuing. The next is at the state level, we convene a statewide coalition of immigrant rights organizations, labor and faith groups that are pushing for the state to start a special fund that would provide disaster relief assistance to undocumented people or to those who have been excluded from the federal relief packages. And we have been working on legislation with a member of the legislature and are in constant conversation with the governor's office as well. I mean, I think the real challenges there have been around how to fund a program when our state is being drained of revenue at the moment. There's no revenue coming into the state, there's extraordinary new costs. And so some of the ideas we've been thinking about there have been, the state is considering doing a bond and sort of using some of that funding to fund a separate disaster relief program. Another idea is the Federal Reserve now has no or low interest loans available to states and cities. And the last is, and of course there's the federal funds potentially in Stimulus 4, which should be voted on this week. And the final is, there's about a dozen cities and states around the country that have set up disaster relief programs, and many of those that are for undocumented people, I should say, and many of those are public-private partnerships. And so I think there's an opportunity in New Jersey to think about, how can we pull together some private funds so that they can be used to sort of help support and push our state to take action so that it can set up, a pool, whether it's a disaster relief fund, whether it's stimulus payments for the 225,000 people who are, or households that are, paying taxes in New Jersey, even though they're undocumented. I think there's different ways of setting it up, and we're exploring a bunch of those options. But I think that's an interesting opportunity for a sort of public-private partnership, as we've seen in California, and as the recent announcement from New York City with the Soros Fund of $37 million. So I'll stop there. I'd love to take questions, and thanks for listening.
Thank you. There's one question in the chat box, and then we can take others. But we have a question about your thoughts on the implications of Trump's latest order stopping immigration and any immediate implications on the communities that are already here.
I mean, I think it's a horrific message of hate and racism. And I'm assuming that the ACLU, if they haven't, filed their injunction yet, they will be on it and hopefully stopping what seems like a wildly unconstitutional act on the part of our president. But, I think it's just, again, sends, a message that's just, really, really horrible to our, to immigrant communities, and is another reason why we need our state and local elected officials to stand up and push back.
Are there any other questions for Sarah?
This is Maria Viscarando. Nice to meet you.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. In regards to your legal support, is that working with volunteers, or how exactly do you set up your legal support?
Yeah, so we have 5 staff attorneys on staff at Make the Road New Jersey, and some of them are handling immigration matters. One is now going to be handling exclusively sort of disaster-related or COVID-related cases, and then another handles employment cases. And so We are doing intakes. We have a hotline set up. I'll share all that information with you all. And then we also have a team of community organizers, about 6 community organizers who are out talking to community members through text, through phone calls every day. And I should also mention that we have a mutual aid project set up where we deliver food to sick members of who we've been working with. Yeah, so yes, definitely those services are open, and we'd love to share resources with you all.
So my other part of that question is, how are you delivering services with the social distancing requirement?
So we shut down our offices on March 13th, and we've been doing virtual legal clinics. And so that means either over FaceTime or Signal or, Zoom we actually don't like to use for for legal clinics because of some of the privacy issues. And then we have, clients take pictures or scan in documents, and we bought each of our attorneys a printer to have at home, and they are printing out and mailing in filing applications. So, excuse me, we adapted pretty well, but there are, of course, many challenges. One being, learning how to, helping our clients and community members figure out how to download different apps and have the sort of bandwidth on their phones to be able to have these different, communication, apps to use.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Thank you.
So maybe what I'll do is, then we can have some final questions if there are some. But maybe what I'll do is, Pastor Michael, are you on the phone with us?
Yes, I'm on.
Great. So, Pastor, why don't you just spend a couple minutes? I appreciate you taking the time yesterday to talk to me a little bit. And why don't you just take a little bit of, a few minutes to tell us about what you're seeing, particularly with, the African community in Newark. I think that would be very helpful for the group to get a full picture of our undocumented community in the city.
Thank you, good gentlemen, and good morning to you all for giving me an opportunity to be able to speak regarding the African community. African community within the state of New Jersey is a big community. And at the same time, most of the time, when I was talking to Mr. Callahan yesterday, I told him that the problem that we are facing here is a problem of trust, in which most immigrant community are facing. The current situation make it difficult for a lot of Africans to be able to come out and that, because we have a system that we rely on each other. That is, if I have a cousin, another cousin will talk to another cousin, that if one cousin is suffering, another cousin can be able to help them out. And that is how we've been living. There are lots of problems that are confronting us, especially with what is going on now. Many that are supposed to come out maybe to find a job in one way or the other that they can help themselves there.
Pastor? It's a little hard to hear you. Are you able to get a little louder? Are you maybe, I don't know if you can get closer to the phone or?
Yes. Can you hear me better now?
Yeah, that's much better. That's much better. Thank you.
Okay. All that I'm saying is that in African community, the community is a knit community that will depend on each other. The problem that we are facing currently, even with the pandemic, most of these people that doesn't have their papers, they work underground. And at the same time, if they don't know you or where you are coming from, they will not talk to you. Even though you might be their representative, or maybe you might be speaking the same language with them, the question of trust is very paramount. if I trust you and I know that, when I speak to you, whatever thing that I speak to you will be here, and it's not going to go to the next level. That's an important something for us as an African. And at the same time, the current situation, what I'm saying is that the eyes is not helping. That is, they are afraid that somebody is going to come to them, arrest them, and take them away, and leave their children suffering. So there's a great pain within the African community, like other undocumented community that is within the states. It's a big community. And what we are doing currently is that, I like to contact other leaders of different organizations in Africa. I represent the African Christian Clergy Alliance, which we have other community leaders that we can talk to. When the call comes in yesterday, I was trying to reach out to others so that we can get the statistics of what is going on. But, I couldn't do that to get the precise information that I need. But this is what I know. It's what I know that I'm trying to report here.
Thank you, Pastor. We really appreciate that. And yeah, I think it would be very interesting, to have a sense, to the best of your knowledge. I don't know if you have a sense now of how large the population is of undocumented people from Africa in Newark. Do you have a sense of how big that population is, or is that something you would need to look for further detail on?
At least the African population in the city of Newark is nothing less than 1,000. Nothing less than that. It's more. When we see African community, we are a big community. Mm-hmm. But we need to be able I need to be able to contact others so that, I can get more information from them.
Okay, that's great. So we'll be sure to stay in touch on that so that we can continue to inform the work that we're all doing and get a fuller picture. And are there any nonprofit organizations? I know something you said to me yesterday that I thought was very helpful was, well, not helpful, but at least good to know, was that many in your community are typically relying on their local churches. And so, right now,
yes,
since churches are closed, that leaves them even further isolated. Are there any, I know some churches are continuing to do some online services and things like that, but are there any other nonprofits or specific churches that are doing a lot of outreach and work right now, or is it still a gap?
There's still a gap in there. We have other people that are just taking things into their own hand and helping out, even though, like when they distribute food, it's not only to the African community. The food have been distributed to the less privileged. We have some African organizations that are doing that are feeding the homeless and so on. Not only to Africans, but to everybody. Since the churches, that church is a place that, we can get the people, but now the churches are not open. Even though if we do teleconferencing or whatever thing, or maybe we work on Zoom, it's not us when the church is in operation. When the church is in full operation, then we'll be able to say, okay, we have so number of places, and it is easier for me to contact the pastors than now that the COVID-19 is in place and rules and regulations are in place.
Okay, thank you for that. Are there any questions from the group? We could probably take maybe like 4 or 5 minutes. Then I want to give David, if he's on, just a few minutes to talk about a school update. But any questions for Sarah or the pastor from anyone?
This is, excuse me, this is Maria. It's not so much a question as just following up on what you asked in regards to social services for the African immigrant in Newark. I'm sure the mayor can name some organizations, but I recall when I was at the United Way that there were a number of sort of like social clubs that have been set up among the African communities, and that was a source of getting informal support in different ways. Also, I recall, is the South Ward Cultural Center still operating in Newark?
I don't.
I
So I don't think so, Maria.
Okay, because
so, yeah.
they used to be a source of support, and also the women's what was that women's group that was housed on Lincoln Avenue? I can't think of it now, and so there were a number of them that probably the mayor can recall if they're still around, that specifically worked with the African community.
Yeah, and the city does have an office of international and diaspora affairs, and so we'll make sure that that office is plugged in with all of us to make sure that we're coordinating and identifying issues and being as supportive as we can.
I also want everybody on the line to know that in very short order, by the end of this week, you're going to see a statement that's coming out from both the council and the Center for Nonprofits that'll be on the website, and we're going to work with TAF Communications to get it placed in other segments, and it's about dealing with scapegoating during this pandemic. So you'll be seeing something to that effect in the next couple of days, both on the website and in a number of other venues.
Great. Okay, so if there are not other questions right now, you could always think of them and type them in the box if you do have them. David, were you able to call in and join us?
Good morning. Yes, I was.
Great. Okay, so I know that we're a little limited on time, so I would just like to get a quick district update, and then we can close out with any other questions that folks have. Sarah and Pastor Michael, if you don't mind staying with us just for a few minutes, if people think of other questions, we could still ask you as well. But David, did you just want to give us a brief update, anything that we should know about the Board of Education? I know that a lot of great work is happening, serving meals, getting technology out to people, etc. So it would be helpful just to get a little update from you.
Sure. So I'll start with the meal program. So as you're all are aware, and first I just want to thank everybody for this opportunity, and also for many of you who have been working directly with us throughout all of this. I just want to thank you for your support. It goes further than you could possibly ever know. So as far as the meal program, we have 16 feeding sites that have been open throughout the course of our virtual schooling. And as of yesterday, we've served over 101,000 meals to families. So with regard to technology, and on April 6th, the superintendent launched our phase 2 of our at-home learning plans. So there was the first 3 weeks, and then phase 2 when we came back off of spring break this week. So this week has been designated as School Spirit Week with a different theme each day. Which has been, so you can go to our website if you're interested in all of the different days, whatever, just try to create some sense of normalcy in an abnormal situation, and just really trying to raise school spirit throughout the district. As far as the technology piece of things, as many of you are aware, and as I've shared with the group earlier through Kevin, there is a digital divide that we've been addressing. At the beginning of this pandemic, we estimated that about 10,500 of our students did not have access to technology at home. We've been able to address the majority of those. So we've to date distributed about 8,000 Chromebooks to families and to students, but that still leaves us with a gap of about 2,500 that we're still trying to work and address and actively seeking support to do so. As far as access to Wi-Fi, we have partnered with different agencies, and Altice has provided free internet to a lot of the families throughout the district. However, there are still Wi-Fi deserts, so to speak. So another thing that is affecting our students and our ability to educate them is we've estimated we're somewhere between 300 and 500 families that don't have access to Wi-Fi. So trying to secure hotspots is another critical need at this point for those families. And the last thing that we're doing and working with some partners to try to address is general school supplies for students at home. We realized that if students are struggling to eat, then having access to pens, pencils, markers, paper, things of that nature at home may be, in fact, a challenge. So we're actually looking to build, supply kits and things to be distributed at our food sites, along with the food for families that need those. But that's pretty much where we are. There's been a lot of great work. Our staff has been tremendous. Our teachers and the support has been tremendous. And it's been an uphill battle from the beginning, but luckily we've had great people doing that work, and our teachers have stepped up, our administrators have stepped up, and it's really incredible what's been able to take place in such a short amount of time. But like I said, there's still some outstanding needs that we're looking to address, but I'm very proud of the work that's been happening in Newark across the city.
Great, thank you. In terms of the food, could you just talk a little bit about, I know there's been some conversation at some points about trying to have food at the sites available for families as well. Have you been able to do that yet, or is that something that's possible?
That's a great question, Kevin. I would tend to defer to Dr. McGill. She's in charge of our food with that. As of now, what we've been doing is we make food available to any student in the city. It doesn't matter what school you go to, where you come to one of the food sites, and they're provided 2 meals a day, and they get them both at the same time. So they come in, they get a breakfast, they get a lunch. As far as, I'm not aware of anyone being turned away from food. I don't think that's the type of people we have. But as far as really, there's been some work with some different donations. We've had we were able to repurpose a grant to pre-K. There was an actual issuance of allowing us to repurpose a grant that wasn't going to be able to be instituted without students in school. So they were able to instead use that money to purchase cards for shopping for all of the families. So each of the families got a $100 grocery card, as opposed to that. So things of that nature. We've had certain donations where they're going to be giving out food to families. So I don't think that it just depends on the availability of that food. So we've had an opportunity to distribute, but as far as more specifics about giving food to families, other than us receiving donations and giving it out, I can definitely touch base with Dr. McGill and see what the plan is specifically for that.
Okay, yeah, that's definitely something, and I'm happy to put you in touch with some folks and work with Catherine, because that's something that maybe we could talk about. If there's a need to have some food on hand at the sites, we can maybe partner with the food bank or something like that.
Absolutely, yeah. We've had donations from food banks and stuff like that, and to specific families. But I think what you're talking about is a larger volume than what we've experienced to this point.
Sure. And then charter school students are, I know some charters are doing their own breakfast and lunch programs from what I've seen, but how does that work? If charters are not doing their own, can the students come to the district sites?
Any student in Newark can come to our food sites and eat. Any child that needs to eat will be fed by the Newark Public Schools. That is not a problem.
Okay,
so,
thank you. And does anybody else have any other questions that you wanted to ask the district right now? David, they're just picking up at the food sites, right? They're not eating there. They're picking up breakfast and lunch.
Correct. It's a grab and go.
Okay.
So it's maintaining social distancing on the lines and all like that to make sure like it's very well managed. The idea is to keep everyone safe, but still make sure that they can eat. So
Great. Okay. Okay, well, thank you, David. We will. I will continue to touch base with you and connect you to folks that are interested in talking about specific items, and we can touch base maybe later on some of the few food items. But thank you for joining us.
truly appreciate it. Thank you very much,
Sure.
and thank
Thanks
you
for
everyone
the
on the
update and
call.
all you're doing.
Yep.
Are there any other? Did anybody think of any other questions? If we still have Sarah, Pastor Michael on the phone. You could feel free to ask, otherwise I could close us out with some fund updates.
Kevin, there was a question in the chat box of what modes of communication are most effective in reaching undocumented people in Newark?
That's a great question. Sarah or Pastor, do you want to take that? Modes of communication?
Sure. I mean, I think there are several like pretty active Facebook and Instagram pages that people are following for updates. So I think social media is a huge pull, and some churches are also, like as everyone's sort of migrating to those platforms, I think that those are great ways to engage people. And I would also just say, for Latinx communities, I think Univision and Telemundo have been really important sources of news and information and sort of the go-to sources. There are a bunch of smaller newspapers, but I'm not really sure people are picking up newspapers anymore, unfortunately. And then I'd also just say, like, we've been experimenting with different technology like Hustle and, different peer-to-peer texting apps, and those have been really effective in terms of helping, community members reach out to their own networks to share information about how to access food, how to, what's the latest on COVID, what's the latest executive order.
Instagram and Facebook are very popular with the Latino community. I remember when we went through Hurricane Maria, it was the only way I could really stay in contact with my family in Puerto Rico when everything else failed. So that's become almost like a regular place for people to communicate.
Great. And I'm also seeing, for those who are with us in the chat box, Kyle posted a link to a merged food site list for schools. Thank you, Kyle. So for those who are for those who are on the phone, I could send out a follow-up email with some items and I'll include that, but there is a merged list that Project Ready created of all the places in the city where students are able to pick up food. So with that, I think what I'll do is I'll just take a brief moment to give an update on funds, and then I'll give Catherine a quick moment to talk about an update from that fund. I did this once before, so I'll go pretty quickly. But as many folks know, the city, the mayor announced $6 million in funding that the city was going to do in addition to the community COVID relief fund that was started at the United Way. So, what I would recommend to everyone, because I know that there are a lot of funds, not necessarily a bad thing because that means there's more money on the table, but we also want to make sure to coordinate. So I would encourage everyone to contact me if you're interested in getting involved and hoping to understand the best place to be involved or where some of the greatest needs are or based on your interest. But essentially, we do have some specific funds, a small business fund that is also housed by the United Way with work with Invest Newark and the city's Department of Economic and Housing Development. That application ends, I believe, on April 30th, but that does not mean that we would not take additional support, because I can only imagine that there were a lot more businesses that have applied than we are able to serve. There was a little over $2 million raised for that fund, $2 million from the city. And then we had private support from Santander, Wells Fargo, TD Bank. I may be leaving out somebody. Prudential was our biggest private donor at $250,000. But that's just a fund that has tremendous need from our small businesses. The Creative Catalyst Fund, which is an arts fund and aptly housed at Newark Arts, that fund is open now for arts organizations, and that closes on May 1st. So if you have arts organizations in your networks that you are funding, you can encourage them to apply for that. The application is on the Newark Arts website. There will be a selection committee of both city representatives as well as representatives from Newark Arts. And then yesterday, the city announced, it had previously announced $1 million available to nonprofits. That application is now open. I can include a link to that in my follow-up email as well, so that you could send that out to your grantees. But that fund is now open and available for applications. And as I've said to folks before, I'm happy to work with Catherine and others on coordinating some of this, just to make sure that organizations are covered as much as possible. So that's really where we are in the city right now. The other two interventions that the mayor announced are also up and running. One was $1 million in supportive housing for homeless individuals, which is being deployed right now in shelter sites, as well as hotels that the city rented for quarantine and isolation. And then there was another investment in Live Newark, which is also a program that will be expanded for people who are interested in doing home improvements or making a payment on their first home. So that's the landscape of where we are right now. I'm also going to circulate a document that I put together that summarizes each of these funds for the reference of everyone on this call, as well as anybody else that it might be helpful for you to share it with. So that will be on the follow-up email for this call as well. And then Catherine, did you just want to give an update on the fund at your fund at the United Way?
Sure. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. So right now, Kevin, just to kind of go back a minute to the Small Business Fund, just to give everybody an update on that, we raised about, between private and public dollars, about $2.4 million. We've had over 1,000 applications from small businesses. So as you can imagine, there's a much greater need than there is obviously available resources. We're going to be announcing those initial grants this week for the first 25 to 30 businesses. We've also made our initial grants out of the general fund for food support, supporting seniors, supporting some public health things that the city's been working on. We did get some additional funds from Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, made a donation, as well as an updated donation from Panasonic. So thank you to both of them. And right now, I would say the biggest need that we're seeing in terms of supporting basic needs for the general fund is kind of what everybody already knows, which is food, rental assistance, things like that. So we don't provide direct funding for food and rental assistance. Of course, we always put it through to our nonprofit partners. But food right now is, we may want to talk about that again next week, is becoming the biggest issue across the city. I think what we're seeing right now is that there are probably more people who are hungry than there are people who are testing positive for the virus. And I think that that's a really important thing to keep in mind, that the biggest impact right now is that people are hungry. So that's it, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Did anybody have any questions or general thoughts or comments as we're closing out?
This is Maria. So, Catherine, how is it the same committee that deals with each one of these areas that you're working on, or is it separate groups, different committees that are set up to deal with each one of these funds?
So the Small Business Fund is a committee between United Way staff, the city's Economic Housing and Development staff, and Invest Newark. So there's a review committee that's working on getting through all the applications. And as you can imagine, having 1,000 of them, it's quite tedious. And then the United Way Advisory, the Funds Advisory Committee is comprised of funders who have donated $500,000 or more.
Mm-hmm.
And 2 technical assistance advisors and the chair of our board.
Okay, thanks.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and then on the other two funds, there will be a selection committee there is a selection committee for both. So all four will have a selection committee.
Do you have time for one more question, Kevin? This is Stephanie.
Yeah, good.
Hi, Catherine. Thanks so much for the update. And just wondering, and I would love to hear more about food on a separate call, as you said, but wondering if you could say a little more about supply, and is the situation of hunger related to a shortage, and sort of how you would characterize that shortage? Is that a lack of funds or a lack of actual stock? And just any sort of additional detail you can give to that circumstance of hunger that you're seeing.
Yeah, sure. So I'll go like big picture first. So as all of us who work and some of us who live in Newark understand, of course, some wards are hit harder because they're always hit harder, right? The South, the West, the East, our undocumented friends, you know, the level of poverty is real. We also know that the feds changed the SNAP rules. And so that has an implication. And now we have an entire workforce that has either been laid off or they have reduced their hours, right? So even just reading these small business grants, a lot of Newarkers have been furloughed and laid off. Even those who were working, you know, minimum wage jobs or above minimum wage jobs, there's simply no income, right? So the need of the number of people who are now seeking relief because of food insecurity is much greater than it has been, I would say, in the last 5 or 10 years that I've been here, right? Number one. Number two, of course, it costs money for the community food bank and other people sourcing food to be able to order the food to get to the city. So for example, we partnered, of course, with the Salvation Army as well to help serve this clearinghouse for organizations. And what we're seeing is, number one, an uptick in the number of organizations who have never distributed food as a food pantry, but who now are seeing a need to do that. Number two, the capacity in terms of funding. We only have the funding capacity to support roughly an extra 2,500 bags of food a week to the city versus the need, which is much greater than that, due to funding at this point. The amount of food that's coming in, that's being donated, either funding to the community food bank or the amount of food that's actually coming in through their sources, doesn't necessarily seem to be an issue as much as getting the funding to be able to increase the number or the pounds of food that are being distributed. The food bank is also distributing meals, actual meals, to the city's public housing sites, the seniors, et cetera. And I think it's also a matter of capacity of, there's only so many people, you know, there's only so many people on staff, there's only so many people that volunteer. And we don't want to send a whole influx of volunteers over to the food bank. That's not my point. But literally just being able to keep up with the supply and demand is a huge issue. So it's a multi-pronged issue. I would say if folks want to support food work, I would definitely give money directly to the food bank and designate that for Newark. I think that's super important. You don't have to give it to us. You can give it directly to the food bank. I think that's really the key. So funding, the amount of people, and the actual ability to keep up with the supply and demand.
Thank you so much.
Yep.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. You know, I mean, our partners have been amazing. I mean, even in terms of meals, I think at the last count, from all of the partners, over 80,000 meals have been delivered to various buildings in Newark, whether they're Newark Housing Authority buildings or privately owned senior buildings. Obviously, Audible's program with World Central Kitchen is delivering 1,000 meals a day with the partnership from local restaurants. You know, so on the city side, I'm working with the mayor's office on trying to route the meals to the right places so that we're covering as many locations as possible. So we're working with Audible on where they're delivering their meals. Same with the food bank when they're delivering actual meals, and other partners that are interested in providing meals. But it's been a very large number of meals that have been delivered. And I think one of the challenges is matching need to supply, but also coordinating groceries versus meals versus dollars for people to purchase what they need with some of the gift card programs. So we want to make sure all of those things are matched appropriately to the right groups and the right populations that need it. So there's definitely a big coordinating element.
Kevin, it's Marsha. I'd like to add that Table to Table is another organization that's doing a tremendous job distributing food in Newark. So when you think about making donations, don't forget Table to Table. They're terrific.
Great, thank you. So I appreciate everyone joining us. I know that we're over, and I apologize, but I think it was a really good conversation today. I think what I've taken out of this is we should definitely spend more time thinking about what we need to learn on the undocumented community and also some action that we might be able to take. And we should probably have some additional and conversations on food as well. And there are some other issues that have arisen that we'll cover in the weeks ahead. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. And as I said, I will send out an email later today that has some follow-up materials from this call to our funder lists, and look forward to speaking with all of you next week. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin.
Thanks so much.